Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey into the quiet, often unacknowledged depths of human resilience when faced with nature's most profound whispers. We're going to delve into a period when the very air seemed to hold its breath, when the world turned a shade of muted blue, and life as it was known had to find new ways to simply persist. As you settle deeper into the quiet of this evening, perhaps consider a gentle tap on the subscribe button and a soft like on the video. Only, of course, if these historical whispers find a welcome place in your thoughts, and if you genuinely find peace in these slow drifts through time. And feel free to share a quiet hello in the comments below, letting us know where you're drifting from tonight. Our destination is a time when the very ground beneath people's feet became a canvas for one of history's most profound environmental shifts, the Great Frost of 1608. Imagine, if you will, a world brought to a standstill not by war or plague, but by the relentless quiet advance of ice. The year is 1608. For most of Western Europe, particularly England and the Netherlands, the early 17th century was already a time of considerable hardship, though perhaps not one that would immediately leap to mind for its severe climate. Yet beneath the veneer of burgeoning trade and burgeoning empires, a subtle shift was occurring in the atmospheric currents, a slow, almost imperceptible turning of the global thermostat. Most people were already well acquainted with the sharp bite of winter, the kind that seeped into your bones and left a lingering ache in your joints. Homes, even for the relatively well-to-do, were drafty affairs, their walls little more than a flimsy barrier against the elements. Fireplaces, while providing a focal point of warmth and light, were often inefficient, sucking precious heat up chimneys and leaving vast swathes of a room in a perpetual state of chill. You might huddle close to the hearth, your back still feeling the icy grip of the outside world, a constant reminder of the thin veil separating comfort from true discomfort. Daily life revolved around the sun's rhythm and the season's demands. For the vast majority, existence was inextricably linked to the land. Farmers, their hands gnarled and skin weathered, tilled the soil, knowing that their very survival depended on the whims of the heavens. A good harvest meant food on the table, a measure of security against the gnawing hunger that was an ever-present specter. A poor one, however, could spell disaster, leading to empty bellies and desperate measures. Grain, typically barley or rye, formed the bedrock of their diet, supplemented by whatever vegetables could be coaxed from the earth, and if fortune smiled upon them, a bit of salted meat or fish. The air often carried the scent of wood smoke, mingling with the earthy smell of unpaved streets, and the sharper, less appealing odors that inevitably accompany dense human habitation in an era without modern sanitation. Beyond the fields, the towns and cities pulsed with their own somewhat different rhythms. Merchants plied their wares in bustling markets, their voices rising above the clamor of hooves on cobblestones and the chatter of the crowds. Craftsmen, their fingers nimble and calloused, worked tirelessly in workshops, producing everything from intricate silverware to sturdy wooden barrels. The Thames in London was not merely a river, it was the city's very lifeline, a bustling highway of commerce. Barges laden with goods, small boats ferrying passengers, and larger vessels preparing for voyages across the North Sea or even the Atlantic would crisscross its gray-green surface. The river was a source of life, a provider of food, and a conduit for trade, an artery through which the lifeblood of the capital flowed. Its currents were a constant, dependable presence, a natural clock that regulated the city's tempo. Yet even in this familiar routine, there were signs, subtle at first, of the deepening chill. Winters had been growing harsher, and the river in particular seemed to hold on to its cold embrace for longer each year. There were murmurs among the older generations, tales of earlier, milder times, dismissed by some as the fanciful recollections of age, but noted by others with a quiet, almost imperceptible sense of unease. People dressed in layers of wool and linen, perpetually trying to ward off the cold that seemed to permeate everything. Even sleep for many was a battle against the chill, with thin blankets and straw mattresses offering little true sanctuary. You might pull your coarse woolen cloak tighter around you as you moved through the dim, flickering light of a January morning, the breath misting before your face, knowing that the real test of winter was still to come, though none could truly predict just how profound that test would be. The resilience of the human spirit was about to be put to an unprecedented test, not against an invading army, but against the silent, creeping might of nature itself. As the calendar pages turned from late 1607 into the early months of 1608, the usual English winter, already known for its raw, penetrating chill, decided to truly assert its dominion. It wasn't an abrupt, dramatic snap of cold, like a sudden slap across the face from a Siberian gale. Instead, it was a relentless, quiet creep, a persistent gnawing at the edges of warmth that few truly acknowledged until it was too late. The temperatures dipped not just for a day or two, but for weeks on end, settling into a polite couple of degrees above freezing, then precisely at it, and finally stubbornly below. You would notice it first in the way the morning mist hung heavier, or how the puddles in the cobblestone streets took on a brittle, reflective sheen that didn't disappear with the rising sun. Your breath, a constant companion in the cold, would now linger longer, twisting into delicate plumes that dissipated slowly into the frigid air. Then came the river. The Thames, usually a tirelessly moving artery of the city, began to feel the true weight of this unprecedented cold. At first, thin, delicate sheets of ice would form along its banks, clinging to the wooden pilings of the wharves like fragile lace. Boatmen accustomed to the swift currents and open water would navigate around these growing fringes, perhaps with a shrug and a grumble about the extra effort required. They were hardy folk, those river workers, intimately familiar with its moods, but even they hadn't seen anything quite like this. The ice grew thicker, expanding its reach from the margins towards the center like a slowly tightening grip. It wasn't the kind of ice you'd skate on in a local pond. This was the mighty Thames, and its sheer volume of water defied such a complete transformation. Yet day after day, the mercury refused to climb and the ice refused to melt. The sounds of London began to change. The familiar slap and creak of oars, the rhythmic chants of the bargemen, the splashing of water against hulls. These everyday noises slowly faded, replaced by an eerie, almost unsettling quiet. In their stead, a new symphony emerged, the faint, resonant groans and cracks of the expanding ice, a living, breathing entity settling into its new, solid state. Imagine standing on London Bridge, the wind whipping at your cloak and looking down, not at the usual churning brown water, but at a vast gray-white expanse. It must have been a sight both wondrous and deeply unsettling. The immediate practical concerns were paramount. The flow of goods, the very lifeblood of the city, began to falter. Coal vital for heating homes and powering industries could no longer be easily transported by river. Food, particularly fresh produce and fish, became scarce. The daily commerce that defined London was grinding to a halt, not by decree or conflict, but by the silent, indifferent hand of nature. For the ordinary Londoner, the transformation of the Thames was an extraordinary spectacle, a topic of endless conversation in taverns and marketplaces. Children, bundled in whatever warm rags their parents could find, would gather at the riverbanks, peering with wide-eyed wonder at the frozen expanse. Adults, initially perhaps with a sense of morbid curiosity, soon began to grasp the true implications. This wasn't just a cold snap. This was something different, something unheard of. The river, which had always flowed, now stood still. It was as if the very pulse of the city had momentarily ceased. People ever resourceful began to test the ice cautiously at first, then with increasing boldness as its thickness became apparent. The necessity for crossing the river, for moving goods, for maintaining some semblance of daily life, outweighed the inherent risks. Necessity, after all, is a persistent muse even when faced with a sheet of ice that could at any moment decide to shift or crack beneath your feet. The Thames, in its new solidified form, quickly became more than just a frozen river. It transformed into an extension of London itself, a vast improvised thoroughfare. The initial tentative steps onto the ice, born of necessity rather than leisure, soon gave way to a burgeoning confidence. People discovered the ice was not merely thick, but astonishingly so, a true geological anomaly. Imagine the feeling beneath your heavy, perhaps ill-fitting boots, not the delicate crackle of a thin pond, but the deep resonant thrum of a solid mass capable of bearing immense weight. The biting wind still swept across its glassy surface, but beneath your feet there was a strange, unyielding stability. The immediate consequence for the city was, of course, a profound disruption of its usual rhythm. The barges, once bustling with coal timber and grain, now sat forlornly trapped in their icy berths, skeletal outlines against the perpetually gray sky. The river's arteries, choked by ice meant essential supplies, struggled to reach the city's heart. Food prices, already a point of constant anxiety for the working classes, began to creep upwards, driven by scarcity and the sheer difficulty of overland transport. Fuel, particularly coal and firewood, became a precious commodity, its procurement an arduous journey through the frozen streets or along perilous makeshift paths. Your evenings, already dim, would have been made even chillier by the necessity of rationing every precious piece of fuel, watching the embers glow with a new kind of reverence. Yet humanity, particularly the industrious and pragmatic kind found in London, rarely stays disrupted for long. Where there is a need, there is an opportunity, even if that opportunity lies on a sheet of ice several feet thick. The frozen Thames, initially a barrier, began to reveal its potential as a stage. The first to venture out were likely those with a practical bent, someone needing to cross the river quickly, or perhaps a daring merchant realizing a shortcut. Then came the entrepreneurs, the ones who could sniff out a shilling amidst the frosty air. Small makeshift stalls began to appear, huddled together for warmth and companionship, selling hot food and warming drinks. The aroma of mulled wine and roasted chestnuts, usually confined to market squares, now drifted across the vast frozen expanse, a strange comfort in the biting wind. The ice surface, once a liquid highway, became a marketplace, a playground, and perhaps most profoundly, a spectacle. What started as necessity rapidly blossomed into an extraordinary form of popular entertainment. Imagine it walking across the very river that usually carried ships rather than yourself. The novelty, the sheer audacity of it, must have been intoxicating. You might see a solitary figure carefully trying to make their way across, slipping and sliding with unpracticed movements. Then, as more people ventured out, the space filled. The sounds returned, but different now. The scrape of skates, the cheerful shouts of children, the low murmur of conversations punctuated by the occasional crack or groan of the ice as it settled, a sound that would send a shiver down your spine despite its relative safety. The ingenuity of people born of hardship was truly remarkable. Small fires, carefully contained within iron braziers, began to dot the ice, their flickering flames providing pinpricks of light and warmth. Stalls grew into small temporary structures, their canvas roofs flapping in the wind. This transformation wasn't simply about commerce. It was about community, about finding moments of collective defiance against the relentless cold. It was, in a very understated way, a triumph of the human spirit, adapting to an entirely new, deeply inconvenient reality with a surprising dash of flair. And it was just beginning to take shape, this ephemeral crystalline city on the river. The frozen Thames, having established its surprising solidity, rapidly evolved beyond a mere thoroughfare or a handful of stalls. It transformed into something altogether more extraordinary, a phenomenon known to history as the Great Frost Fair of 1608. Imagine for a moment the sheer audacity of it, an entire temporary city, a pop-up metropolis of ice springing forth from the frozen waters. This wasn't merely a few hardy vendors. This was an organized, bustling spectacle, a testament to humanity's almost bewildering capacity to find amusement and profit in the most unlikely of circumstances. The range of activities on the ice was remarkable. Skating, a relatively new pastime, flourished, as did sledging and various other improvised games. You might have seen groups of bundled-up Londoners, their breath puffing out in white clouds, sliding across the slick surface with a surprising grace, or perhaps more likely, a comical lack thereof. For those seeking a more organized diversion, bowling alleys were set up, the clatter of pins echoing strangely over the vast expanse. Even horse-drawn carriages, typically confined to the rough and often muddy streets, ventured out onto the solid river, their iron-shod hooves making a muffled clop on the ice, a bizarre reversal of roles for the river and the road. The market aspect of the fair quickly diversified. Beyond the initial purveyors of hot drinks and basic sustenance, a full array of merchants set up shop. Portable kitchens, some little more than large pots over roaring braziers, dispensed hot pies, roasted meats, and warming porridges. The air would have been thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke simmering stews, and perhaps, if you were lucky, the sweet earthy aroma of roasting root vegetables. Taverns, too, sprung up their temporary structures, offering a place to escape the biting wind for a moment, to huddle around a small fire and share a tankard of ale or mulled wine, the warmth spreading through your chilled limbs. It was a potent, if fleeting, antidote to the pervasive cold. One of the most curious and enduring aspects of these frost fairs was the printing press. Entrepreneurs, seizing the opportunity, would set up small, hand-operated presses directly on the ice. For a small fee, you could have a commemorative card or broadsheet printed bearing the date, the location on the frozen Thames, of course, and perhaps a small woodcut image of the scene. These ephemeral souvenirs, often printed on cheap paper, served as tangible proof of having witnessed and participated in such an unprecedented event. Imagine holding a piece of paper still faintly damp from the ink, a personal artifact from a truly surreal moment in time, knowing that the very ground it was printed on would soon revert to a rushing river. The social fabric of London seemed to stretch and contort on the ice. The strictures of everyday class divisions, while never entirely absent, softened somewhat amidst the novelty. Wealthy gentry, their faces flushed from the cold, and perhaps a touch of excitement, rubbed shoulders with tradesmen and laborers. Everyone, regardless of their station, was navigating the same icy landscape, experiencing the same peculiar blend of wonder and discomfort. For some, it was a grand novelty. a temporary escape from the rigid etiquette of their lives. For others, particularly the working poor, it was a desperate gamble to earn a few pence selling what little they had or performing small services in the hopes of survival. The laughter and revelry of the fair therefore had a strange, almost melancholic undertone for those who knew that the return of the river would also mean the return of their more conventional hardships. Yet, for a brief, remarkable period, the river became a democratic stage where cold was the great equalizer and shared experience the common currency. The transformation of the Thames into a grand temporary stage during the Great Frost of 1608 was more than just a novelty. It was a profound act of collective improvisation, a fleeting architectural marvel born of necessity and human spirit. The sheer scale of the Frost Fair, once it had fully taken root, was astonishing. Imagine navigating this sprawling village of ice, hundreds of stalls, their canvas flaps snapping in the wind, clustered together like a hastily erected army camp. Small temporary structures, sometimes little more than wooden frames covered with tarpaulins or salvaged fabric, lined what were now icy avenues and winding lanes. The sounds of the fair, usually muted by distance, carried sharply in the cold, crisp air. The hawkers' cries, the fiddles and pipes of itinerant musicians, the laughter of revelers, and the constant low murmur of 1,000 conversations. Beyond the hot pies and mulled wine, the fair offered a surprisingly diverse array of goods and services. Barbers set up makeshift shops, their steaming basins a rare luxury in the pervasive cold. Tailors offered quick repairs to threadbare garments, their needles flying in the frigid air. Even cobblers found a brisk trade patching worn boots that were now more vital than ever for traversing the slick, uneven surfaces of the icy landscape. The scent of roasted meats mingled with the more acrid tang of coal smoke, and perhaps the faint lingering smell of raw sewage from the edges of the temporary encampment. This wasn't a pristine, idyllic winter wonderland. It was a rough, vital, and undeniably human response to a frozen reality. One could even find less savory, though equally pragmatic enterprises. Pickpockets, ever opportunistic, would have found rich pickings among the distracted crowds. Gamblers huddled around dice or card games, their hands red and chapped, would try their luck, perhaps fueled by a warming dram of spirits. And of course, the taverns on the ice already mentioned became a central hub. Their warmth, a magnet for those seeking respite from the unrelenting chill. These establishments, despite their temporary nature, often sought to replicate the cozy, smoky atmosphere of their land-based counterparts, with rough-hewn tables and benches and the constant clink of pewter mugs. You could almost forget for a moment that you were standing on several feet of frozen river, the sounds of the water utterly silenced beneath your feet. The psychological impact of the frozen Thames cannot be overstated. For centuries, the river had been the embodiment of movement, of change, of the very flow of time in London. Its sudden, profound stillness was a monumental disruption to the collective consciousness. It was a tangible manifestation of the world being turned upside down, a natural order suspended. This sense of the extraordinary fueled the fair's popularity. People flocked to the ice, not just for goods or entertainment, but to witness the marvel, to be part of something unprecedented, to etch into their memories the surreal image of a city thriving on water that refused to yield. It was a shared experience of profound wonder, an almost dreamlike quality that must have clung to the memory long after the ice had broken. Yet beneath the festive veneer, the underlying hardships remained. For those living on the margins, the fair offered fleeting opportunities, but it did not erase the gnawing hunger or the bone-deep cold in their rented rooms. The constant effort to keep warm, to find food, to simply exist, was an exhausting, unrelenting battle. Even if you escaped to the fair for a few hours, the reality of a perpetually frozen world where wood was scarce and food prices soared would eventually draw you back. The Frost Fair was a remarkable spectacle, a defiant flourish against a grim backdrop, but it was also a stark reminder of the fragile balance between humanity and the indifferent power of nature. And as the weeks stretched on, that balance would be tested even further beyond the temporary diversions of the ice. While the Great Frost Fair captured the imagination and offered a peculiar kind of merriment, it was at its core a symptom of a much larger, more pervasive crisis. The freezing of the Thames, though spectacular, was merely the most visible manifestation of an unprecedentedly severe and prolonged cold snap that gripped not just London, but much of Western Europe. The air for weeks on end remained stubbornly below freezing, a constant sharp bite that penetrated even the thickest woolens. You might find yourself perpetually hunched shoulders drawn up trying to shrink away from the invisible tendrils of cold that seemed to find every seam in your clothing, every crack in your dwelling. This wasn't just about an uncomfortably cold winter. It was about the profound disruption of fundamental systems that underpinned society. Agriculture, already dormant for the winter months, faced a grim outlook for the spring. The ground, frozen to a remarkable depth, resisted any efforts at preparation for planting. Farmers gazing out at their unyielding fields must have felt a cold dread deeper than any temperature. The frost penetrated the soil, killing off overwintering crops and making any early spring planting impossible. This threatened not just the immediate harvest, but the very sustenance of the coming year. The implications for food security for a population already living close to the margins of subsistence were dire. Imagine the anxiety that would settle in your stomach, a knot of worry about where the next meal would come from, not just for tomorrow, but for months down the line. Beyond the agricultural impact, the prolonged cold created a cascade of other challenges. Water sources vital for daily life began to freeze. Ponds, shallow rivers, and even wells became solid blocks of ice, making the simple act of drawing water an arduous, often frustrating task. Imagine the effort required hacking away at ice with crude tools, your hands growing numb, the sheer physical exertion adding to the daily burden of survival. Sanitation, already rudimentary, deteriorated further as frozen waste became immovable. The stench, usually dissipated by flowing water and warmer air, would have hung heavy and stagnant in the frigid atmosphere, a constant, unpleasant reminder of the unyielding conditions. Disease, an ever-present threat, found fertile ground in these cramped, unhygienic conditions, though the bitter cold may have temporarily suppressed some types of contagion. The timber trade, crucial for construction and shipbuilding, was also severely impacted. Trees brittle with frost were harder to fell and transport. The waterways, the primary means of moving large quantities of timber from the forests to the bustling shipyards and building sites, were impassable. This had ripple effects across the economy, slowing down construction projects, impacting industries that relied on wood, and leaving many laborers without work. For those who earned their living through physical labor, the cessation of these vital industries meant a sudden crushing loss of income. You might wander the silent docks, seeing the idle ships and the empty wharves, feeling the cold seep into your very bones, not just from the weather, but from the chilling prospect of an empty purse and an uncertain future. The collective mood, despite the initial novelty of the Frost Fair, began to shift. The quiet resignation that often accompanies winter hardships slowly gave way to a deeper weariness, a pervasive sense of being trapped by the relentless cold. Hope for a thaw, initially a daily prayer, became a distant whisper. People gathered around whatever meager fires they could sustain, sharing what little food they had, their conversations turning from the marvels of the ice to the more pressing realities of their shrinking provisions and the relentless gnawing cold. The extraordinary had become the ordinary, and the ordinary was a struggle for survival. As the great frost settled in its icy fingers, reached into every corner of society, but their grip was undeniably tighter on some than on others. For the affluent, those who resided in grand houses with multiple hearths and servants to procure whatever scarce resources remained, the cold was an inconvenience, a challenge to be met with furs, extra logs, and perhaps a grumble about the lack of fresh oysters. They could afford the inflated prices of coal and candles. Their pantries were stocked with salted meats and preserved fruits, and their bodies, softened by a lifetime of comfort, were protected from the raw elements. Their suffering, if one could call it that, was more an annoyance, a disruption to their accustomed luxury. You might find them lamenting the cancellation of a social engagement or the difficulty of travel, rather than the more fundamental worries of mere survival. But for the vast majority, for the laborers, the street vendors, the artisans, and the countless poor who made up the bustling backbone of London, the frost was a relentless existential threat. Their dwellings, often small rickety affairs with thin walls and leaky roofs, offered scant protection. The wind whistled through ill-fitting windows and under drafty doors, making a mockery of any attempt to generate heat. Imagine huddling with your entire family in a single small room, perhaps sharing a threadbare blanket, the warmth from a meager fire barely reaching beyond your immediate circle. The nights would have been long punctuated by the shivers that ran through your body despite your best efforts. Sleep, a precious commodity even in good times, became a fitful, fragmented affair, constantly interrupted by the creeping cold and the gnawing hunger. The cessation of normal trade and industry hit these groups particularly hard. The rivermen, once so vital to the city's commerce, found their livelihoods literally frozen. Dock workers stood idle, their muscles accustomed to heavy lifting, now twitching with disuse and hunger. Shopkeepers unable to receive new supplies or reliant on foot traffic that dwindled in the extreme cold saw their profits evaporate. Many faced the agonizing choice between buying expensive food or saving what little money they had for rent. Eviction, a terrifying prospect, even in mild weather, became a death sentence in the depths of the frost. You might see families, their meager possessions, bundled in cloths, wandering the icy streets, nowhere to go. No source of warmth, a chilling testament to the frost's unforgiving social commentary. Community bonds, however, often tightened in the face of such shared adversity. Neighbors, usually preoccupied with their own struggles, found common cause in the fight against the cold. Stories of shared firewood of a neighbor bringing a small portion of a precious hot meal to a struggling family, or of collective efforts to clear frozen pathways, became more common. These acts of quiet, desperate generosity were not always grand or widely publicized, but they were the threads that prevented the entire social fabric from unraveling. It was a stark reminder that in times of truly profound distress, humanity's innate capacity for empathy, though often overshadowed in daily life, could still flicker into being a small flame against the overwhelming darkness. Yet even with such resilience, the psychological toll was immense. The novelty of the frost fair eventually wore off, replaced by a grim monotony. The constant cold, the perpetual hunger, the endless struggle simply to maintain a basic level of warmth and sustenance began to chip away at the spirit. The mind, too, grows weary from constant vigilance against a threat that never dissipates. The outside world became a hostile, indifferent entity, a vast frozen expanse that seemed to mock human endeavor. You might find yourself staring out a window, watching the endless gray sky, and wondering if the sun would ever truly feel warm again, or if this new frozen world was simply the way things were now, a chilling new normal that stretched endlessly into the horizon. As the weeks of the Great Frost stretched into an unforgiving eternity, the initial novelties of the frozen Thames began to fade into a grim, unyielding reality. The sheer resilience of Londoners, though remarkable, was being tested to its absolute limits. The struggle for warmth, once a daily inconvenience, became a full-time occupation. Every scrap of wood, every lump of coal was guarded with the intensity usually reserved for precious jewels. You might find yourself scouring the desolate outskirts of the city, or even venturing into public parks, eyes peeled for fallen branches, anything that could offer a few fleeting moments of heat. The sound of axes, usually a sign of industry, might now be heard where trees were being felled not for building, but simply for desperate warmth. The city's green spaces, once manicured, began to show the scars of this relentless pillaging, a stark visual representation of a populace pushed to extremes. The scarcity of food deepened into a critical concern. With river trade halted and roads often impassable, fresh produce became a distant memory. Grain, while storable, was finite, and its price skyrocketed beyond the reach of many. Your diet would likely have shrunk to a monotonous, calorie-deficient routine, perhaps a watery gruel or a stale piece of bread savored slowly, each mouthful a quiet act of survival. The occasional fish caught with immense difficulty through holes chopped in the ice, or a piece of scavenged meat would have been considered a feast. The constant low hum of hunger in your stomach became a familiar if unwelcome companion. This wasn't just a matter of discomfort. It was a matter of life and death, particularly for the very young and the very old, whose frail bodies simply lacked the reserves to withstand the relentless assault of cold and starvation. The authorities, both municipal and ecclesiastical, were certainly aware of the burgeoning crisis, though their capacity to respond was inherently limited by the technology and infrastructure of the era. Parish churches and wealthy philanthropists often organized soup kitchens or distributed meager alms, but these efforts, though commendable in their intent, were but drops in the vast ocean of need. You might queue for hours in the biting wind, your fingers stiff with cold, hoping for a thin bowl of broth, knowing that hundreds more behind you were just as desperate. The queues themselves became a silent testament to the scale of the suffering, a visible manifestation of collective despair. The king and his court, largely insulated by their wealth and the thick walls of their palaces, might issue decrees or offer symbolic gestures, but the daily grinding reality of the frost remained largely unseen and unfelt within their gilded cages. This particular frost, devastating as it was not an isolated incident. It was, though unknown to those experiencing it, a prominent feature of a much larger ongoing climatic phenomenon, what historians would later term the Little Ice Age. This period, lasting roughly from the 14th to the mid-19th century, was characterized by colder average temperatures, increased glacial expansion, and more frequent and severe winters across the northern hemisphere. The Great Frost of 1608 was simply one of its most dramatic and memorable expressions in England. So while you shivered in your inadequate clothing, the cold was not merely a temporary affliction, but part of a deeper, centuries-long trend, a slow, inexorable shift in the planet's pulse that profoundly shaped human history. This broader context adds a layer of quiet solemnity to the individual struggles. It wasn't just a bad winter. It was a testament to the persistent long-term vulnerabilities of human civilization when confronted with large-scale environmental change. The ice on the Thames wasn't just a frozen river. It was a symbolic mirror reflecting a profound alteration in the climate itself, challenging existing structures and forcing an adaptation that extended far beyond a temporary fare. The relentless grip of the Great Frost didn't merely alter the landscape, it profoundly impacted the human body and mind, pushing people to the very brink of endurance. For many, the constant, pervasive cold became a slow, insidious enemy far more dangerous than any sudden illness. Respiratory ailments always a threat in an age without proper ventilation, and with omnipresent wood smoke surged. Imagine the constant rasping coughs echoing through your thin-walled home, the ache in your lungs with every cold breath. Frostbite, a silent and merciless predator, would creep in first, numbing fingers and toes, then turning them black with gangrene. The pain, if you were lucky enough to survive the initial stages, would have been excruciating, leading to disfigurement or often amputation without anesthetic, a grim choice born of desperate necessity. The sight of people limping missing digits or with faces scarred by exposure would have become disturbingly common, a quiet testament to the frost's brutal efficiency. Malnutrition exacerbated by the skyrocketing food prices and scarcity further weakened already vulnerable populations. When your body is constantly battling to maintain its core temperature, it burns through calories at an alarming rate. Without adequate fuel, the immune system falters, turning a common cold into a deadly pneumonia, a minor cut into a festering infection. The vitality slowly drained from people, leaving them gaunt, their eyes sunken, their movements slow and deliberate, conserving every ounce of precious energy. You might find yourself perpetually lethargic, your thoughts cloudy, simply focusing on the next most immediate need. Warmth, a morsel of food, a brief respite from the shivering. Beyond the physical suffering, the psychological toll was immense. The sheer monotony of the cold, the endless gray skies, the perpetually frozen landscape could breed a profound sense of despair. Hope, a fragile commodity even in the best of times, seemed to shrivel and die under the frost's unyielding gaze. People would gaze at the frozen Thames no longer with wonder, but with a weary resignation, an internal clock ticking, waiting for a thaw that seemed forever delayed. In an era deeply steeped in religious belief, some might have seen the frost as divine punishment, a manifestation of God's wrath, adding a layer of existential dread to the daily struggle. Others might have simply felt a deep, chilling sense of isolation, even amidst the crowds of the frost fair. This level of desperation also tested the boundaries of social order. While we noted instances of quiet community support, there were inevitably also rising tensions. Petty crime born of hunger and cold likely increased. Instances of theft of desperate attempts to acquire food or fuel would have strained neighborly relations. The delicate balance of societal norms could fray when the basic needs for survival became paramount. Imagine the internal conflict, the innate human desire for order, battling the primal urge to simply survive, no matter the cost. It was a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of civility can be when the fundamental pillars of existence are shaken. And this wasn't just a localized phenomenon affecting London. The Little Ice Age in its grand, indifferent sweep affected much of the Northern Hemisphere. Contemporary accounts from the Netherlands, from Germany, and from Scandinavia speak of similar, if not worse, hardships. Rivers like the Rhine and the Elbe also froze, solid, disrupting trade and plunging vast swaths of land into deep, sustained cold. This was a continental-scale challenge, a vast, slow-moving environmental disaster that transcended borders and afflicted millions. So, as you ponder the struggles of those Londoners on their frozen river, remember that countless others across Europe were enduring their own versions of this relentless, bone-chilling test, a collective human experience of adaptation to an increasingly unforgiving world. The Great Frost of 1608, while an acute period of suffering, was also a powerful, if brutal, teacher. For those who endured it, and for generations that followed, the memory of that unyielding cold of the frozen Thames and the precariousness of daily existence lingered like the faint chill that never quite leaves an old stone house. It wasn't merely a historical anecdote. It became a cautionary tale, a reference point against which all subsequent winters were measured. "Is it as bad as '08?" you might hear someone murmur, gazing out at a particularly heavy snowfall, a quiet acknowledgment of a shared, deep-seated memory. This collective experience, repeated through many such harsh winters during the broader Little Ice Age, began to subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, reshape the rhythms of life. While modern meteorological forecasting was centuries away, people developed an intuitive, almost visceral understanding of the changing climate. Farmers, for instance, learned to adjust their planting and harvesting schedules, perhaps favoring more cold-hardy crops or investing more heavily in grain storage. The precariousness of a single harvest was profoundly underscored. Imagine the communal effort involved in digging deeper cellars or constructing more robust granaries, driven by the very real fear of another empty winter. It was a kind of slow-motion forced evolution in agricultural practice, a quiet revolution born of cold necessity. Building practices, too, saw gradual, incremental shifts. While radical changes were slow to come, there was a growing emphasis on tighter construction, on insulating drafty windows with oiled paper or thicker panes where possible, and on designing fireplaces that, while still inefficient by modern standards, at least retained a little more heat. The very layout of homes might subtly adapt, with living spaces shrinking to conserve warmth, or with the integration of internal chimneys that could radiate heat more effectively. Your awareness of even the smallest gap in a wall, the slightest whisper of a draft under a door, would have become acutely honed. Comfort, or merely the absence of severe discomfort, became less about luxury and more about survival. The societal infrastructure also began to feel the cumulative weight of these cold centuries. Water management, though primitive, became a greater concern. The freezing of rivers and wells led to innovations, albeit basic ones, in transporting and storing water, perhaps through the use of larger covered cisterns, or the strategic placement of wells in areas less prone to deep freezing. The need for readily accessible, non-frozen water for drinking, cooking, and even basic hygiene became a paramount consideration, leading to more resilient, if still imperfect, solutions. Furthermore, the Great Frost of 1608 and similar events reinforced the stark realities of social inequality. While the rich could endure, albeit with grumbles, the poor suffered and died. This brutal truth wasn't always enough to spark widespread social reform in an age of rigid hierarchy, but it did underscore the fragility of the social contract. It prompted in some quarters renewed efforts at charitable giving, particularly from the church and wealthy benefactors, acknowledging the vital need to prevent total societal collapse. These acts of charity, though insufficient for the scale of the problem, became an ingrained part of winter life, a recognition that the community, however imperfectly, had to provide some kind of safety net, however threadbare, against the unyielding forces of nature. The quiet, persistent cold served as an equalizer in its impact, but a brutal differentiator in its consequences, a chilling lesson that echoed far beyond the immediate thaw. The prolonged chill of the Little Ice Age, of which the Great Frost of 1608 was a particularly sharp manifestation, etched itself not just onto the landscape and the architecture, but deep into the very cultural fabric of the time. It wasn't simply a matter of enduring cold. It was a redefinition of what normal truly meant. The mild green England of Shakespeare's earlier plays seemed to be giving way to a more somber, muted palette, a world where the gray skies and persistent damp became defining features of the national character, or at least its daily reality. This shift permeated everything from the types of clothing people wore heavier and more layered to the very structure of their daily routines, now more consciously geared towards conserving warmth and energy. Consider the role of public entertainment and social gatherings. While the Frost Fair was a unique explosion of defiance and merriment, regular social life often retreated indoors, clustered around the warmth of communal fires in taverns or the larger homes of the wealthy. Storytelling, card games, and communal singing would have gained even greater importance, serving not just as entertainment, but as a crucial means of fostering human connection against the isolating chill. Imagine the quiet comfort of a collective breath visible in the cold air as a shared tale unfolded, or the warmth of a shared laugh momentarily chasing away the shadows of the frost outside. The cold made people appreciate the small, tangible comforts, the flicker of a candle, the warmth of a hand, the simple presence of another human being. The arts, too, subtly reflected this environmental shift. While not immediately obvious in every painting or poem, the pervasive cold and its consequences filtered into the collective consciousness. Landscape paintings might depict more somber, snow-laden scenes. Literature could subtly weave in themes of human resilience against unforgiving nature or the stark inequalities revealed by hardship. Think of the grim realities of peasant life depicted in some European art, where the figures are bundled and hunched, battling an unseen chill. Even in popular ballads and folk songs, you might find subtle allusions to the hard winter or the bitter winds, becoming ingrained metaphors for life's struggles. The very language used to describe the world began to reflect its colder, harsher reality. The ongoing struggle against the cold also fostered a practical ingenuity, often rooted in traditional knowledge passed down through generations. People learned to read the subtle signs of the weather, to predict the severity of coming days, not through instruments, but through the behavior of animals, the shift in winds, or the particular feel of the air. This folk wisdom, born of necessity and survival, became a vital, if unwritten, body of knowledge. Your grandparents or an elderly neighbor might offer quiet counsel on when to bring livestock indoors, or how best to insulate a drafty window with rags and clay, knowledge accumulated through countless previous winters, lessons hard-won against the indifferent forces of nature. The Great Frost of 1608, therefore, was not merely an isolated cold snap, but a powerful defining moment within a larger climatic epoch. It forced a societal introspection, a re-evaluation of humanity's place in the natural world. It demonstrated the fragility of established systems and the remarkable, if often desperate, resilience of people. The memory of the frozen Thames and the ephemeral city that bloomed upon its surface became a symbol of this paradox, a period of profound hardship that also witnessed extraordinary human adaptation and, even in its own unique way, a strange form of collective celebration of life against the odds. The cold was a constant, but so was the human spirit, stubbornly refusing to yield. The Great Frost of 1608 while an acute shock to the system truly highlighted how deeply integrated humanity was with its environment, particularly regarding water. The Thames, as we've explored, wasn't just a river. It was London's primary artery for commerce, sanitation, and even social interaction. Its prolonged immobility forced the city to invent on the fly entirely new ways of living. Beyond the grand spectacle of the Frost Fair, which lasted only as long as the ice held firm, there were countless micro-adaptations that became part of the daily grind. Consider the logistics of simply moving around the city. The usual network of ferries and small boats was useless. Pathways across the ice were often slippery, uneven, and crowded. Imagine the daily commute for a craftsman or a market worker. A treacherous journey made longer and more physically demanding, bundled against the unrelenting cold. Each step a conscious effort to avoid a debilitating fall on the treacherous surface. The very concept of time seemed to slow down, dictated by the glacial pace of the environment. News and correspondence, which typically flowed with the river's current, were now delayed, trickling in slowly via frozen roads or daring overland couriers. This communication breakdown would have amplified the sense of isolation, making the world beyond one's immediate frozen environs feel even more distant and inaccessible. You might wait weeks for a letter from a loved one in another town. The delay a constant nagging worry, knowing that the journey itself was fraught with peril. The world shrank, becoming a series of frozen, isolated pockets connected by increasingly tenuous threads. The reliance on wood as a primary fuel source, which was already straining England's forests, became even more pronounced during such severe winters. The demand for firewood skyrocketed, leading to rapid deforestation in accessible areas. This in turn had long-term ecological consequences, contributing to soil erosion and further altering local microclimates, inadvertently intensifying future cold snaps. It was a vicious cycle. The cold demanded more fuel. The increased demand depleted forests, and the depleted forests offered less protection, contributing to colder conditions. You might have witnessed the once wooded hillsides gradually thinning, replaced by stark skeletal trees, a testament to the insatiable hunger for warmth. This relentless need for fuel also meant that timber usually earmarked for construction or shipbuilding was diverted for heating, impacting critical industries and slowing national development. Beyond the practicalities, the psychological landscape of a perpetually cold world was also profound. The concept of winter transformed from a seasonal pause into an extended siege. The human spirit, while resilient, is not limitless. Periods of depression and melancholy likely increased, exacerbated by poor nutrition, lack of sunlight, and the sheer physical exhaustion of battling the elements. The stark contrast between the vivid, colorful imagery of warmer seasons, perhaps remembered from childhood, and the relentless gray and white of the frozen present, would have been a constant, quiet burden. Yet within this bleakness, there was also a strengthening of character, a grittiness born of continuous struggle. People learned to endure, to find small joys in communal warmth, to appreciate the simple miracle of a hot meal or a dry place to rest. The Great Frost of 1608 therefore provides a microcosm of the Little Ice Age's wider impact. It wasn't just a period of low temperatures. It was a profound environmental challenge that forced societies to reevaluate their relationship with nature, to adapt their daily routines, and to confront the stark realities of their own vulnerabilities. The memory of the frozen Thames glistening eerily under a leaden sky wasn't just a spectacle. It was a chilling, enduring lesson in the immense power of nature and the stubborn, often quiet resilience of the human spirit in the face of its most formidable challenges. The lessons learned often through immense suffering would ripple through the centuries, shaping policies, practices, and even the collective memory of a nation. In an era before the precise instruments and global networks of modern meteorology, understanding the underlying causes of a phenomenon like the Great Frost of 1608 was a truly elusive endeavor. For many, particularly, the vast majority of the populous explanations were often sought not in scientific principles, but in the realm of the divine or the astrological. A prolonged cold snap, a devastating flood, or a widespread famine might be interpreted as a sign of God's displeasure, a punishment for collective sin, or perhaps a warning of impending apocalypse. Sermons from the pulpits would undoubtedly have linked the unyielding cold to moral failings, urging repentance and piety as the only true means of thawing the heavens. You might find yourself quietly pondering your own transgressions, attributing the bone-deep chill in your bones to some unseen celestial ledger. Alongside religious interpretations, popular beliefs often turned to the celestial spheres. Astrologers, highly regarded even by some educated elites, would consult their charts looking for ill-omened planetary alignments or conjunctions that might explain the unusual atmospheric conditions. The movements of Saturn, a planet associated with cold and melancholy, might be scrutinized, its influence blamed for the Earth's frigid temperament. While we, with the benefit of hindsight, understand the complex dance of atmospheric currents and solar activity for them, these grand distant forces felt like the most logical explanation for something so profound and disruptive. Imagine the earnestness with which these theories were discussed, the quiet desperation for any explanation that could make sense of such an unsettling world. Yet amidst these older modes of understanding, the seeds of a more empirical approach were beginning to sprout, albeit slowly, and often quietly. The 17th century was, after all, the dawn of the scientific revolution. Natural philosophers, the precursors to modern scientists, though still bound by many ancient dogmas, were increasingly interested in systematic observation. While a true thermometer as we know it was still evolving, Galileo's thermoscope was a rudimentary step. There was a growing interest in recording weather patterns, even if it was as simple as noting "very cold" or "much snow" in a diary alongside the daily mundane entries. These individual observations, scattered and uncoordinated, as they were represented a nascent desire to quantify and understand the natural world. The Great Frost, therefore, might have served as a subtle, persistent catalyst for this emerging scientific curiosity. When the Thames, a seemingly immutable force, froze solid, it was not just a marvel, it was a profound puzzle. Why? How long would it last? Was there a discernible pattern? Such events, which defied common experience and caused immense suffering, undoubtedly prompted a deeper, more systematic scrutiny of the environment. While no instant breakthrough in meteorology emerged directly from the 1608 frost, it contributed to the growing intellectual climate where the natural world was increasingly viewed as a subject for empirical study rather than solely divine interpretation. The sheer magnitude of the frost, its prolonged and undeniable presence, simply demanded attention, forcing minds to look beyond the immediate and the supernatural towards the observable and the quantifiable. The chill, in a strange way, became a quiet spur to inquiry. While those shivering through the depths of the Great Frost of 1608 sought explanations in the divine or the celestial, our modern understanding, pieced together over centuries of patient observation and scientific inquiry, offers a rather different picture. The brutal cold wasn't a sudden isolated fit of pique from the heavens, but rather a profound symptom of a larger global shift that we now refer to as the Little Ice Age. This protracted period, which saw colder average temperatures and more frequent extreme weather events, was not due to one singular cause, but rather a complex, almost orchestral interplay of natural forces, each contributing its own chilling note. One of the most significant factors that scientists now point to is changes in solar activity. Our sun, that glorious orb of warmth and light, isn't quite as constant as it appears from Earth. It experiences cycles of activity marked by the appearance and disappearance of sunspots, cooler, darker regions on its surface that are associated with periods of increased magnetic activity and, crucially, slightly higher solar output. During the Little Ice Age, and particularly around the time of the 1608 frost, there was a prolonged and significant reduction in sunspot activity, a period known as the Maunder Minimum. Imagine the sun, usually a bustling, energetic star, just quietening down a little. A subtle dimming, perhaps not enough to plunge the world into darkness, but enough to reduce the amount of solar radiation reaching Earth. Even a fractional decrease in incoming energy can have profound effects on our planet's delicate thermal balance. It's like turning down the global thermostat just a notch and then forgetting where you put the knob for a few decades. Adding to this solar slumber were dramatic bursts of volcanic activity. When a large volcano erupts, it doesn't just spew out lava and ash. It launches vast quantities of sulfur dioxide and other aerosols high into the stratosphere. Once there, these tiny particles can linger for years, forming a reflective veil that scatters incoming sunlight back into space before it can warm the Earth's surface. Think of it as a natural sunshade deployed by the planet itself. Historical records and ice core samples from the period reveal several significant eruptions, such as those that occurred in 1600, Mount Huayna in Peru, and others in subsequent decades. Each of these massive expulsions would have contributed to a global cooling effect, acting like an emergency brake on the planet's warming mechanisms. You might remember the stunning sunsets reported around the world after such events, the sky ablaze with unnatural hues, a beautiful yet ominous sign of atmospheric disruption. Then there are the complex, often unpredictable dance of oceanic currents. The vast currents that crisscross our oceans are like colossal conveyor belts distributing heat around the globe. Slight shifts in patterns, such as the North Atlantic Oscillation, or changes in thermohaline circulation, the deep ocean currents driven by temperature and salinity differences, could have played a role in pushing more cold water towards certain regions, or in altering the delicate balance of heat exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere. It's a system of immense inertia, so changes are slow and subtle, but their long-term impact can be profound, shaping the climate of entire continents. It was this confluence of factors, a quieter sun, an increase in atmospheric veiling from volcanoes, and shifts in oceanic heat distribution, that conspired to create the conditions for the Little Ice Age, making events like the Great Frost of 1608 not just possible, but tragically inevitable. For the Londoner trying to keep warm in their drafty dwelling, or the merchant lamenting the frozen Thames, there was no such grand, comprehensive explanation. They simply felt the cold, a relentless, unyielding presence that shaped their lives in ways they could neither fully understand nor control. We, with our scientific insights, can trace the lines of cause and effect, but the visceral human experience of that biting cold remains a chilling, potent reminder of nature's immense power. The Great Frost of 1608, remarkable as it was not an isolated meteorological tantrum. It was instead one of the more dramatic flourishes in a multi-century symphony of colder conditions that fundamentally reshaped human existence across vast swaths of the globe. This protracted period, which saw colder average temperatures and more frequent extreme weather events, was not a constant, unbroken deep freeze, but rather a series of more frequent, more intense cold snaps, punctuated by shorter, less reliable warm periods. It was a prolonged flirtation with winter's harsher moods, a general lowering of the planetary temperature that affected everything from agricultural yields to the very landscape itself. Imagine for generations the growing season becoming consistently shorter, the sun less reliable in its warmth. For societies utterly dependent on agriculture, this meant a perpetual tightrope walk. Farmers, already at the mercy of localized weather, now faced a climate that seemed to actively conspire against them. Cereal crops, which require a certain number of warm, frost-free days to mature, often failed to reach their full potential. Yields dwindled, leading to increased instances of famine and food scarcity. Your ancestors might have learned to diversify their crops, perhaps planting more root vegetables that could withstand frost, or developing more robust methods of food preservation, like salting and smoking, simply out of a desperate need to survive the lean months that seemed to stretch longer and longer. The knowledge of which crops were most resilient, passed down through the generations, became as vital as any inheritance. The impact extended far beyond the immediate sustenance of life. The colder temperatures meant that once navigable rivers and canals froze more frequently and for longer durations, disrupting trade routes and economic activity across Europe. The vibrant markets and bustling ports, reliant on the flow of goods, found themselves intermittently paralyzed, leading to price volatility and economic instability. When a key waterway like the Rhine or the Elbe became impassable for months, entire regions suffered. You can picture merchants anxiously consulting almanacs, trying to gauge the severity of the coming winter, their fortunes literally dependent on the capricious nature of the freezing point of water. This forced an increased reliance on overland transport, which was slower, more expensive, and often more dangerous due to snow and ice. Furthermore, the Little Ice Age played a subtle yet significant role in shaping the geopolitical landscape. Reduced agricultural output could lead to internal unrest as hungry populations grew desperate. It could also influence migration patterns as people sought warmer climes or more fertile lands. While it's too simplistic to say that the cold directly caused wars or revolutions, it certainly acted as a significant stressor, exacerbating existing tensions and pushing already vulnerable societies closer to the brink. A hungry populace, a struggling economy. These are often the kindling for broader social change, whether peaceful or violent. Even the aesthetic and recreational aspects of life adapted. The proliferation of ice skating, as we saw on the Thames, became a prominent winter pastime across northern Europe, a unique cultural response to the frozen conditions. Winter carnivals and festivals built around the ice and snow became more elaborate and frequent, a collective embrace of the cold rather than a mere endurance of it. In a strange twist, the very severity of the climate sometimes led to new forms of communal joy and artistic expression, a testament to humanity's stubborn refusal to be entirely defined by hardship. The long drawn-out reality of the Little Ice Age wasn't just a challenge. It was a slow, inexorable force that quietly reshaped the world, one cold winter at a time, teaching resilience, forcing innovation, and forever altering the relationship between humanity and the subtle yet immensely powerful rhythms of its home planet. The persistent chill that defined the Little Ice Age, vividly punctuated by events like the Great Frost of 1608, wasn't merely a series of individual cold winters. It constituted a continuous grinding pressure that slowly but profoundly reshaped human technology and resource management. Necessity, as the old adage goes, is indeed the mother of invention, and when that necessity is warmth and sustenance in a perpetually colder world, ingenuity finds its way. While we might not imagine the 17th century as an era of rapid technological advancement, the challenges posed by the cold spurred countless small incremental innovations that over generations contributed to greater resilience. Consider, for instance, the subtle evolution of heating mechanisms within homes. Open hearths, while iconic, were incredibly inefficient, sending most of their heat directly up the chimney. The prolonged cold encouraged the development of more enclosed fireplaces, often with narrower flues or even rudimentary backplates designed to radiate heat more effectively into the room. While far from modern central heating, these small improvements represented a significant step towards retaining precious warmth. The practice of building smaller, more compact homes, or even partitioning larger rooms with heavy tapestries or temporary screens, also became more widespread, consciously creating smaller, more manageable spaces to heat. You might find yourself gathering not just around the fire, but within the smallest, warmest corner of your dwelling, a chosen sanctuary from the ambient chill. Beyond the hearth, the management of fuel became an increasingly sophisticated art. The sheer volume of wood and coal required to stave off the cold during extended winters put immense pressure on existing supply chains. This led to innovations in timber felling and transport with improved tools and methods for moving heavy logs over frozen or muddy terrain. The demand also drove the development of coal mining, pushing deeper into the earth for the black gold that offered a more concentrated, longer-burning heat source than wood. The emergence of specialized trades such as coal merchants and woodcutters became more prominent, their services vital to the very survival of urban populations. The smell of burning coal, a distinct acrid scent, would have become as ubiquitous as wood smoke in London's winter air. Food preservation, already critical, gained new urgency. While salting and drying meat and fish were ancient practices, the reliability of these methods became paramount. The colder temperatures, paradoxically, could also aid in preservation, allowing for natural freezing of some foodstuffs. However, without controlled environments, this was a precarious balance. Communities often invested in larger, deeper root cellars designed to keep vegetables like carrots, potatoes, once they became more common, and turnips cool but not frozen, allowing them to last through the long winters. There was a quiet, almost ritualistic aspect to these preparations. The gathering, the cleaning, the careful layering in sand or straw, all done with the solemn knowledge that these stores represented the thin line between survival and starvation. Even the humble art of clothing saw adaptation. While heavy woolens remained the staple, there was a greater emphasis on layering on tightly woven fabrics and on insulating materials like felt. The very construction of shoes and boots became more robust, designed to offer better protection against the penetrating cold and moisture of perpetually damp or frozen ground. You would spend a significant portion of your income and your daily effort simply on warding off the cold, a constant low-level war waged with fabric and fire. The ingenuity wasn't grand, but it was pervasive, a testament to humanity's tireless efforts to bend nature to its will, even when nature seemed overwhelmingly dominant. These were the quiet triumphs, born of extreme necessity, shaping daily life in subtle yet profound ways. Beyond the material adaptations and the subtle shifts in technology, the relentless chill of the Little Ice Age, so starkly exemplified by the Great Frost of 1608, began to subtly reshape the very fabric of human society, influencing daily rituals and collective behaviors. Life, particularly during the long, dark winters, became a more communal affair, often by necessity. Homes, even those of modest size, became hubs of shared warmth. Families would huddle closer together, not just for affection, but for the literal body heat that could ward off the penetrating cold. Your evenings would likely involve everyone gathering in the single heated room, perhaps sharing a meal or simply sitting in quiet companionship around the flickering fire, the silence broken only by the crackle of burning wood and the whisper of the wind outside. This enforced intimacy born of the cold sometimes strengthened family bonds, but it also inevitably amplified any existing tensions. Imagine being confined for weeks or months in close quarters, the air thick with wood smoke and stale breaths, the constant hum of hunger in your stomach, and the pervasive chill seeping into every corner. Patience, already a virtue, would have been tested to its limits. Yet for many, the collective struggle fostered a deep sense of mutual reliance. It wasn't just a matter of individual survival. It was the survival of the household, the family unit dependent on each member's quiet contribution, whether it was chopping wood, mending clothes, or simply offering a comforting presence. The relentless cold also gave rise to specific social rituals designed to cope with winter's demands. Winter feasts and celebrations often tied to religious holidays like Christmas or pagan traditions related to the solstice took on an even greater significance. They weren't just periods of merriment. They were vital psychological breaks from the relentless monotony of cold and hardship. These gatherings, often involving the consumption of stored provisions and whatever fermented beverages could be produced, served as powerful affirmations of community and resilience. Imagine the joyful anticipation of such an event, the rare indulgence in food and drink, the brief escape into warmth and fellowship, a defiant act against the long, dark nights. The singing, dancing, and storytelling would have been imbued with a deeper meaning, a collective act of warming the spirit as well as the body. Furthermore, the omnipresence of cold and its associated hardships subtly wove itself into the folklore and storytelling of the era. Tales of hardship, of brave individuals battling against overwhelming natural forces, or of the mysterious spirits of winter, would have resonated deeply. The natural world, already imbued with symbolic meaning, became even more potent as a force that could both provide and destroy. The deep snows, the frozen rivers, the biting winds, these weren't just meteorological phenomena. They became characters in the collective narrative, powerful entities that shaped human destiny. You might hear stories told by the flickering light of a hearth, tales of ancestors who survived even worse winters, or warnings about the dangers of venturing too far into the frozen wilderness, lessons implicitly passed down about the delicate balance between human endeavor and nature's raw power. This constant negotiation with the environment also influenced the very mindset of the people. There was a pervasive fatalism, perhaps, but also a profound pragmatism. One learned to appreciate the small mercies, a clear, sunny day, even if cold, a successful hunt, a particularly robust harvest from the previous year. The memory of the Great Frost, therefore, wasn't just a historical record. It was a deeply ingrained cultural memory, shaping perspectives on resilience, resourcefulness, and the enduring human capacity to find warmth and connection even in the most unforgiving of environments. The cold, in its own silent way, fostered a unique kind of community spirit, a shared understanding of what it truly meant to endure. While the general populace battled the omnipresent cold with ingenuity and communal resilience, the Great Frost of 1608 and the broader Little Ice Age also cast a long, chilling shadow over the elite and the corridors of power. For those at the top of the social hierarchy, life was undeniably more comfortable, cushioned by wealth and access to resources that were mere dreams for the common person. Their homes were grander, their hearths larger, and their servants numerous enough to fetch fuel and provisions regardless of cost or difficulty. You might imagine a nobleman complaining about the lack of fresh fruit at his winter table, while outside families huddled desperately sharing a single stale crust of bread. Yet even within these privileged circles, the frost brought its own set of challenges, though they were of a different nature. The disruption of trade routes, particularly by the freezing of major rivers like the Thames, had significant economic repercussions that extended to the royal coffers and the mercantile classes. Taxes collected from trade would have dwindled, affecting the crown's ability to fund its armies, maintain its infrastructure, or embark on ambitious new projects. Merchants, their ships locked in ice or unable to reach their destinations, faced ruinous losses, disrupting the flow of capital and credit that underpinned the burgeoning national economy. The intricate web of international commerce reliant on predictability and consistent flow was severely strained. Imagine the frantic correspondence between wealthy merchants discussing losses, delayed shipments, and the spiraling costs of goods, their fortunes literally frozen in place. The political stability of the realm was also subtly yet profoundly affected. While the immediate aftermath of the 1608 frost might not have led to open rebellion, repeated crop failures and widespread food scarcity during the Little Ice Age historically fueled popular unrest across Europe. A hungry populace is a volatile one, and while direct links are complex, periods of extreme cold and famine often correlated with peasant revolts, riots over food prices, and increased banditry. Rulers and their advisors would have been acutely aware of this underlying discontent, seeing the grumbling masses as a potential threat to their authority. Measures, however inadequate, would be taken to control prices or distribute some relief, less out of genuine benevolence and more from a pragmatic need to maintain order. The court itself, a center of political intrigue and social maneuvering, would have experienced its own unique form of seasonal adaptation. Statecraft, usually a process of travel meetings and public display, became more confined. Decisions would be made in chilly chambers, perhaps with breath misting even before the highest officials. Diplomacy, vital for maintaining peace and alliances, could be hindered by impassable roads and frozen seas, delaying crucial negotiations and exchanges. Imagine the frustration of ambassadors and envoys stuck in a foreign land, their diplomatic missions literally put on ice by the unyielding weather. Beyond the immediate practicalities, there was a deeper philosophical undercurrent. For a ruling class that often saw itself as divinely appointed and in control of its destiny, the sheer indifferent power of nature, as demonstrated by the Great Frost, could be a humbling force. It was a reminder that even the most powerful monarch was ultimately subject to forces beyond human control. This might have led to heightened religious observance, more fervent prayers for a thaw, or even a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in worldview, acknowledging the limits of human dominion. The Great Frost of 1608, therefore, wasn't just a challenge for the common folk. It was a profound, chilling reminder to the elite that even their gilded cages were not entirely immune to the biting breath of an unforgiving world. The Great Frost of 1608, and indeed the broader climatic phenomenon of the Little Ice Age, left an indelible mark on historical records, not just through official documents, but through the more intimate and often poignant accounts found in personal letters, diaries, and local chronicles. These seemingly mundane entries, scribbled by individuals in the flickering light of a candle, offer invaluable glimpses into the lived experience of that profound chill, providing a human dimension to the stark meteorological facts. They are whispers from the past, telling tales of endurance, desperation, and unexpected moments of joy. Imagine the entry in a London merchant's ledger. Item this day, no ships did come to port, the river being frozen quite solid. A loss of X. This dry economic notation silently speaks volumes about the disruption of commerce and the financial anxieties that rippled through the city. Contrast that with a diary entry from a commoner, perhaps a tradesman or a housewife. The breath hangs in the air, even indoors. Children cough. No wood to be had save at great price. Pray God for a thaw. Such lines, stark in their simplicity, convey the sheer physical discomfort, the gnawing worry, and the deep reliance on faith in a world where human agency felt woefully inadequate against the forces of nature. You can almost feel the chill emanating from the yellowed pages, hear the quiet desperation in their words. Local parish records, typically dry lists of births, marriages, and deaths, might also offer grim, indirect evidence of the frost's impact. A noticeable spike in mortality rates during particularly harsh winters, especially among the very young and the elderly, would quietly testify to the devastating effects of malnutrition, hypothermia, and frost-related illnesses. The sheer volume of burials, sometimes recorded with a brief matter-of-fact note like, "died of the cold," paints a somber picture of lives brutally cut short by the unyielding cold. These were not statistics to them. They were neighbors, family members, faces you passed every day in the streets, now gone swallowed by the unyielding cold. Beyond the grim details, these records also capture the remarkable human capacity for observation and adaptation. Chroniclers often noted the astonishing thickness of the ice on the Thames, the exact dates of its freezing and thawing, and the specific activities that took place on the frost fair. These detailed observations, while lacking modern scientific rigor, demonstrate a keen interest in documenting an unprecedented event, a desire to record for posterity the marvel and the hardship. Some might have attempted to measure the ice, others to simply describe the strange temporary city that blossomed on the river, their words serving as a kind of proto-journalism, capturing the fleeting reality of a world turned upside down. These historical accounts, therefore, are more than just dusty old texts. They are a profound connection to the past, allowing us to glimpse the resilience, the suffering, and the quiet dignity of people living through one of history's most dramatic climate shifts. They remind us that history is not just about grand events or famous figures, but about the countless anonymous lives lived out day by day against a backdrop of immense natural forces. The whispers from those frozen days continue to resonate, inviting us to reflect on our own vulnerabilities and our own capacities for endurance in the face of an unpredictable world. As the great frost of 1608 eventually loosened its grip, a slow, grudging thaw began bringing with it a complex mixture of relief and renewed challenges. The ice on the Thames, once a solid highway, started to crack and groan with a different kind of sound. Not the settling thrum of its formation, but the ominous shriek of disintegration. At first, small fissures would appear spiderwebbing across the vast expanse, then larger cracks, until eventually the ice began to break up into colossal flows. The river's surface transformed into a turbulent, churning mass of ice chunks, a dangerous, unpredictable landscape that rendered it even more impassable than when it was fully frozen. Imagine the thunderous crashes as massive sheets collided the water underneath, regaining its voice, a deep, resonant roar that signaled the end of the frost fair, but the beginning of a new kind of peril. The immediate aftermath of the thaw brought its own set of dangers. The broken ice floes carried by the reawakened current posed a significant threat to bridges, wharves, and any ships that had been trapped or moored along the banks. The London Bridge, already a marvel of engineering, would have groaned under the pressure of the ice battering its sturdy piers. Houses built precariously close to the river, or structures on the river itself, like watermills, faced the risk of being swept away or severely damaged. For those who had built their temporary livelihoods on the ice, the thaw meant a scramble to retrieve their goods and dismantle their stalls before the river claimed them. The bustling frost fair, with its laughter and commerce, vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only scattered debris and lingering memories. Beyond the physical danger, the thaw also brought sanitation issues to the forefront. The accumulated waste from weeks of frozen immobility, now released by the flowing water, contributed to a surge in waterborne diseases. The air, no longer crisp and dry, would have grown heavy with the dampness and the unappealing odors of thawing refuse. Fevers, dysentery, and other ailments that thrived in such conditions often followed severe winters, claiming lives that had managed to endure the cold itself. You might have survived the frost only to face a new invisible enemy brought by the return of the water. Economically, the thaw brought a cautious sense of hope, but full recovery was a slow, arduous process. The river trade could resume, but ships and barges needed to be checked for damage, and the waterways themselves still presented navigational challenges until all the ice had cleared. Food prices, though no longer climbing, would remain high for some time as agricultural supply chains needed to recover from the impact of frozen fields and delayed planting. The widespread hardship endured by the working classes meant that demand for non-essential goods would remain low, further hindering economic revival. It wasn't a sudden return to prosperity, but a gradual, painstaking climb out of the economic trough. The memory of the Great Frost, however, remained a powerful shaping force. It became a benchmark for future winters, a chilling reminder of nature's formidable power and humanity's enduring vulnerability. For many, it deepened a sense of fatalism, a quiet acceptance that such devastating events were simply part of life's unpredictable cycle. Yet it also reinforced lessons in resilience, in the power of community, and in the necessity of adaptation. The collective experience of enduring the frozen Thames and the odd, vibrant life that sprang up upon its surface became a part of London's folklore passed down through generations, a testament to a time when the world truly stood still and humanity found a way to not just survive, but to create and even to celebrate on a river of ice. The legacy of the Great Frost of 1608 and the pervasive cold of the Little Ice Age extended far beyond the immediate suffering and economic disruption. These events subtly yet profoundly influenced the very long-term development of European societies, particularly in regions like England and the Netherlands. The repeated stress of severe winters acted as a constant low-grade pressure forcing innovations and adaptations that might not have occurred with such urgency in a milder climate. It was a slow generational process of learning to live with and even thrive despite a colder world. One significant long-term impact was on energy consumption and the development of new fuel sources. As we discussed, the demand for wood, already high, became unsustainable during these cold periods. This scarcity, coupled with the difficulties of transport, provided a powerful impetus for the widespread adoption of coal as a primary heating fuel. While coal mining had existed for centuries, the Little Ice Age spurred its expansion and improved technologies for extraction and distribution. Cities like London, with their burgeoning populations, increasingly relied on this more calorific and compact fuel. You might consider the subtle but profound shift in the very scent of the cities, from primarily wood smoke to the more acrid, pervasive smell of coal burning a tangible marker of this energy transition. This shift had its own environmental consequences, of course, contributing to urban air pollution, but it was a crucial adaptation for survival. Agriculture. The cornerstone of any pre-industrial society also underwent a quiet revolution. Farmers, having repeatedly faced crop failures and shortened growing seasons, became more experimental. The introduction and gradual adoption of new, more resilient crops, such as the potato from the Americas, which could grow in poorer soils and colder conditions, gained significant traction in some regions. While potatoes weren't widely adopted in England until much later, the general pressure to find alternatives to traditional grains became more pronounced. There was also a greater emphasis on animal husbandry, as livestock could provide both food and warmth through their body heat in enclosed spaces, and their manure was vital for replenishing depleted soils. The very calendar of agricultural work from planting to harvest was reevaluated and adjusted, leaning towards caution and robustness rather than optimistic assumptions about the weather. The constant threat of famine and scarcity driven by poor harvests also contributed to the evolution of social welfare systems, however rudimentary. While widespread state-sponsored welfare was far off local parishes, guilds and wealthy philanthropists often refined their systems of poor relief during and after periods of extreme hardship. The concept of a common responsibility for the most vulnerable members of society, while often rooted in religious doctrine, gained practical urgency when the consequences of neglect were so visibly devastating. These informal safety nets, however thin, were critical in preventing widespread starvation and social unrest. You might feel a quiet sense of communal obligation in these actions, a recognition that everyone in some way was interconnected in the battle against the elements. Finally, the Little Ice Age fostered a subtle but growing emphasis on scientific observation and record-keeping as people tried to make sense of the erratic climate. While not immediately leading to breakthroughs in meteorology, the continuous experience of unusual weather patterns fueled the intellectual curiosity that would eventually lead to the Enlightenment and the systematic study of the natural world. The raw data of the frost of frozen rivers and late thaws became part of the burgeoning scientific discourse, a quiet call to understand the forces that shaped their lives. The Great Frost of 1608, therefore, was not merely an event to be endured. It was a powerful, chilling lesson that subtly steered the course of history, forcing a slower, more deliberate path towards adaptation and ultimately a more resilient future. The Great Frost of 1608 stands as a vivid historical case study in the human response to environmental extremes, offering a fascinating comparison to how modern societies might grapple with similar challenges, albeit with vastly different technological and infrastructural capabilities. While we no longer face the prospect of the Thames freezing solid for weeks on end, the historical account of 1608 provides a quiet, almost contemplative lens through which to examine our own vulnerabilities and adaptations in the face of climate change. In 1608, London's lifeline, the Thames, froze. Today, a comparable disruption might be the failure of a major power grid during a heat wave or a prolonged cyber attack on essential services. The impact for a modern city would be less about physical cold and more about the cessation of complex interconnected systems, communications, transportation, healthcare, and finance. While we have robust emergency services and global supply chains, the vulnerability of our digital infrastructure and reliance on constant energy could prove just as paralyzing, albeit in a different way. Imagine your phone going dark, the internet ceasing to exist, and the lights flickering off, not for hours, but for days or weeks. The modern parallel might evoke a different kind of fear, but one rooted in the same fundamental human dependency on systems beyond immediate individual control. The resourcefulness demonstrated during the Great Frost, from the spontaneous formation of the frost fair to the individual efforts to secure fuel and food, highlights humanity's innate capacity for improvisation. In 1608, people adapted using what was immediately available: their physical labor, their local knowledge, and their community bonds. In a modern context, while our solutions would involve high-tech equipment, satellite communication, and organized relief efforts, the underlying human spirit of problem-solving and mutual aid would likely remain. You might witness a similar quiet surge of community support: neighbors helping neighbors, sharing scarce resources, albeit perhaps with generators and stored water bottles instead of chopped wood and hand-drawn well water. However, the 1608 frost also starkly exposed social inequalities. The wealthy, while inconvenienced, largely survived. The poor suffered disproportionately. This, sadly, is a pattern that persists through time. Modern climate events, from hurricanes to heat waves, often hit the most vulnerable populations hardest: those without adequate housing access to health care or financial reserves to recover. The quiet, uncomfortable truth from 1608 is that extreme environmental events act as cruel magnifying glasses, highlighting existing societal fractures. The discussions about climate justice today echo, in a very real sense, the unspoken inequities of those frozen centuries, reminding us that resilience is not uniformly distributed. Ultimately, the Great Frost of 1608 serves as a potent, if understated, reminder of our enduring connection to the natural world. Despite all our technological advancements, our cities, our economies, and our daily lives remain intricately intertwined with the subtle rhythms of the planet's climate. The events of 1608 underscore that ignoring these rhythms, or assuming complete control over them, can have profound and devastating consequences. It's a quiet historical lesson that whispers across the centuries our survival and well-being are, and always have been, in a delicate dance with the forces of nature, a dance where adaptability and foresight are perhaps our most vital partners. And as you reflect on this, perhaps a deeper understanding of our shared past can offer a gentle guidance for our shared future. The Great Frost of 1608 and the long shadow cast by the Little Ice Age also had a subtle yet pervasive influence on the scientific understanding and artistic representation of weather itself. Prior to this period, meteorological observations were largely anecdotal, driven by agricultural needs or navigational concerns. But as winters grew demonstrably harsher and more unpredictable, there was a growing intellectual curiosity, a quiet scientific awakening to the dynamic, often capricious nature of the atmosphere. While true meteorological science was still nascent, the repeated experiences of phenomena like the frozen Thames encouraged more systematic, albeit still rudimentary, forms of data collection. Gentlemen scientists, or natural philosophers as they were known, began to keep more detailed weather diaries, noting temperatures using early thermoscopes, wind directions, and the presence of snow and ice with greater precision. These individual efforts, though uncoordinated, formed a quiet foundational layer for future scientific inquiry. The very act of observing and recording, of trying to find patterns in the chaos of extreme weather, was a significant intellectual leap. You might picture a solitary scholar hunched over a parchment by candlelight, diligently noting the frost on his window pane, driven by a quiet, almost obsessive desire to understand. In the realm of art, the Little Ice Age provided a wealth of new subjects and shifted established aesthetics. Before this colder period, European landscapes often depicted verdant fields, sunny skies, and temperate scenes. However, with the increasing frequency and severity of winter artists, particularly in the Low Countries, where canals and rivers froze regularly, began to embrace the winter landscape as a legitimate and compelling subject. Painters like Peter Bruegel the Elder, though active before the peak of the Little Ice Age, captured the essence of winter life with a grim beauty, showing skaters on frozen ponds and people huddled against the cold. Later artists, directly experiencing the colder climate, further popularized these scenes. The Dutch Golden Age, for example, saw an explosion of winter landscapes, often depicting bustling scenes on frozen waterways with figures skating, playing, and going about daily life amidst snow and ice. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were often realistic portrayals of a lived reality, a celebration of human resilience and activity in a challenging environment. The muted palette of blues, grays, and whites, punctuated by the browns and reds of human figures, became a defining characteristic of these works. Imagine gazing at such a painting, not just seeing a scene, but feeling the biting wind, hearing the scrape of skates, and smelling the crisp, cold air, a sensory experience transported across centuries. Even beyond direct depiction, the concept of cold and winter sometimes entered literary and philosophical discourse as a metaphor for hardship, endurance, or profound change. The very language used to describe the world began to reflect the chill, with words like bleak, raw, and penetrating gaining deeper resonance. 469 vượt quá 10.000 ký tự. The enduring narratives of events like the Great Frost of 1608 and the broader Little Ice Age offer more than just a historical account. They serve as profound meditative opportunities on the quiet, persistent forces that shape human existence. These stories, unfolding over centuries, underscore the notion that progress is rarely linear, and that even the most established societies can be profoundly tested by environmental shifts. The resilience demonstrated by the people of London who adapted their lives to a temporarily frozen river is not merely a tale of survival, but a quiet testament to a deep underlying human adaptability that often goes unacknowledged in times of ease. Imagine for a moment the sheer physical and psychological fortitude required to simply exist in a world where the primary source of warmth and food was constantly uncertain. You wake up each morning not to the gentle hum of a central heating system, but to the biting air that has seeped through the cracks of your dwelling. Your first thoughts are not of coffee, but of the dwindling woodpile or the price of coal at the market. Every decision, from how you dress to what you eat, is filtered through the lens of resource conservation and the relentless pursuit of warmth. This constant, low-level vigilance, a perpetual battle against the elements, would have shaped not just individual lives, but entire communities, fostering a collective pragmatism and an almost spiritual appreciation for the fleeting moments of comfort. The ingenuity, too, is remarkable. The transformation of a frozen river into a bustling market and playground wasn't a top-down decree. It was an organic, spontaneous eruption of human spirit and entrepreneurial drive. It speaks to a deep-seated human capacity for innovation under pressure, a quiet, almost playful defiance in the face of immense adversity. The very act of setting up a printing press on the ice, for instance, seems whimsical, almost absurd, until you consider the desperate desire for a souvenir, a tangible piece of memory from a truly unprecedented time. It's a subtle reminder that even in the most grim circumstances, humanity finds ways to express its unique blend of practicality and poetry. These historical drifts through periods of climatic challenge also gently remind us of the precarious balance between human endeavor and the natural world. In our modern age, with our sophisticated technologies and apparent mastery over our environment, it's easy to forget that we are at our core still deeply dependent on the planet's rhythms. The Great Frost, with its stark simplicity, strips away these modern illusions, revealing the fundamental vulnerability of even a thriving metropolis when confronted with the unyielding forces of nature. It's a quiet whisper from the past, urging us towards humility and foresight. As the echoes of the frozen Thames fade, and the quiet resilience of those Londoners settles in your thoughts, consider the enduring lessons, the subtle power of adaptation, the vital warmth of community in times of cold, and the profound, humbling dance between humanity and the greater natural world. It is a story not just of cold, but of comfort, found in unexpected places, a testament to the quiet strength that lies within us all, waiting to be called upon when the world turns unexpectedly. And now, as the last echoes of the Great Frost begin to dissipate, and the images of a frozen London slowly recede from your mind's eye, allow yourself to drift further into the present moment. Feel the comforting warmth of your own dwelling, so different from the drafty homes of centuries past, so secure from the chill winds we've just explored. The constant hum of modern life, usually so distracting, now serves as a gentle lullaby, a soft reminder of the conveniences that cocoon us. Your bed, perhaps, with its soft mattress and warm blankets, offers a sanctuary that would have been an unimaginable luxury in those cold, distant years. Let your breathing slow, becoming deep, and even a gentle rhythm, carrying you further into the quiet of the night. The historical journey is complete. The details, the stories, the echoes of a world frozen in time can now simply blend into the soft fabric of your subconscious. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to worry about, nothing left to imagine, but the gentle, drifting warmth of sleep. Rest now deeply and peacefully,